Jake had always felt the silence in his life more than he understood it. Growing up in the Wisconsin foster system, birthdays were marked by caseworker visits and donated cupcakes. Holidays came with rotating homes, names he couldn't always remember, and promises that slipped away as easily as breath in cold air. No photographs of babyhood, no bedtime stories passed down. Just a small, battered envelope he was handed when he turned 18. Inside was a silver ring on a thin chain and a note written in gentle, slanted handwriting. "This belonged to your mother. She wanted you to have it. She couldn't find you. I'm sorry." The ring never left him. It sat like a quiet truth around his neck, simple, unassuming, but persistent. Engraved inside, so faint it could barely be read without tilting it into the light, were the words, "I am here." The promise of someone who had once tried to stay. Someone who had once loved. He never wore it to be seen. Only touched it when the world felt too loud, when he doubted whether he belonged anywhere at all. And now, here it was again, around someone else's finger. Lacey stared at her hand as if it had betrayed her. The matching ring on her finger had always been her comfort. Her mother had given it to her when she was 10, after a particularly bad day at school where Lacey had come home crying because other children whispered about her not having a father. Claire had knelt beside her, kissed her forehead, and slid the ring on her finger. "This is yours," she had said. "And when you feel alone, just read what's inside." Lacey had read it so many times, the words were memorized, "You're not alone." She had thought it was just for her. That the comfort was hers alone. But now the meaning changed. It was a half-truth. A message meant to be completed. Neither of them spoke much in the cafe after the rings had been revealed. There was no rush. Just the sound of the espresso machine hissing behind the counter and the low murmur of other conversations that suddenly seemed too loud, too ordinary. Later that evening, after hours of quiet walking through the park and tracing memory backwards, Jake shared what he knew. He had been told that he came from a fire. That the building, a children's shelter, had caught fire in the middle of the night. That no one knew who had dropped him off weeks before. That his paperwork was incomplete. That when the fire was over, he had survived, pulled from the wreckage by someone who disappeared before anyone could identify them. A social worker had speculated that a volunteer had carried him out before disappearing into the chaos. The only thing left with him was the ring. His name had been assigned at random. Jake Reeves. The past erased with a penstroke. Lacey listened, stunned, as pieces of her own childhood surfaced with new clarity. Her mother had once worked in Wisconsin, she knew that. There had been photos in an old shoebox, one of a rundown building with peeling white paint, a faded sign in the background, Hope House for Children. Lacey had never asked. She had never thought to. But now she remembered something sharper. When she was 12, she had asked her mother why there were no baby pictures of her before age 4. Claire had paused, smiled, and said only, "Some families don't start at the beginning. Some start when they're meant to." Claire had adopted her, that much was clear. But the timeline was blurred, obscured by secrecy. There had been late-night phone calls Claire had quickly ended. Government envelopes that went unopened, or were stuffed into drawers. Lacey had always assumed they were medical bills or taxes. Now she wasn't so sure. They began digging. Phone calls were made to county offices. Old adoption files were requested, but redacted. What was left were fragments, mentions of fire damage, misplaced records, and guardians listed under initials instead of names. Claire Jordan's name never appeared. But in the archived newspapers from 1992, they found a photograph of a woman covered in soot, cradling a child in front of a charred building. No names were given. Just a caption, "Unidentified volunteer rescues child from Hope House fire." The woman's eyes were unmistakable. Lacey had seen those eyes every day in the mirror. Her mother, 20 years younger, arms wrapped protectively around a small boy with a gauze bandage on his arm. Jake leaned in. "That's me," he said, softly. As if it hurt to admit. And Lacey realized the truth had been sitting in her family drawer for years, hidden in plain sight. Her mother had carried Jake from the fire. But something had gone wrong. Medical treatment had taken weeks. Records had been lost, names had been changed, systems had failed. Claire had tried to find him. But she was told no such child existed anymore. She had returned weeks later to be told that all the children had been placed. That no one by the name of Jake, or with the matching birthmark she described, could be identified. A door had closed in her face. And yet, she had not walked away empty. Months later, she had adopted Lacey. Lacey, who remembered a soft voice reading her stories. Who remembered a silver ring placed gently on her finger. Who remembered her mother's eyes welling with tears on birthdays, for reasons never explained. Now those tears made sense. She had not only loved one child. She had lost one, and tried to start again. Jake and Lacey sat in her apartment late that night, surrounded by old shoeboxes filled with relics. Photos, letters, a worn postcard from Wisconsin dated 1993. On the back, in her mother's careful hand, it read, "To the one I lost, if you're out there, I still look for you." And on the bookshelf, tucked behind a stack of cookbooks, Lacey found it, a sealed envelope addressed to my children. Plural. She didn't open it. Not yet. Because somehow, just the knowledge that it existed was enough. The rings were no longer strange coincidences. They were proof. Proof of a love that had survived a fire, outlived systems, and waited patiently, engraved in silver, for the day the truth would finally return home. It was a strange kind of grief, mourning something you never knew you had. Lacey sat in her living room, her knees pulled up under her chin, the silver ring still on her finger, spinning slowly. Across from her, Jake had fallen asleep on the couch, the faded envelope resting against his chest like a weight he didn't know how to carry. The photograph from the newspaper was pinned to the corkboard behind him now, next to a copy of his military discharge papers and a sticky note scribbled with questions neither of them yet knew how to answer. The next few weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, archives, and awkward questions posed to agencies that had long ago stopped caring about the stories they once handled. Most of the buildings involved in the 1992 fire had since been torn down. The shelter's records had been damaged by both flames and bureaucracy. What hadn't burned had been boxed away in a state storage facility and left to rot. They requested everything: adoption files, fire department logs, hospital admission reports from that week. It took time. It took patience. But slowly, like water seeping through cracks, the truth began to rise. There was the fire incident report. The blaze had started in the early hours of the morning, believed to be caused by faulty wiring. 6 children had been rescued. One of them was listed only as Boya, found unconscious outside the building, carried out by an unidentified woman with visible burn injuries. No name had ever been logged for her. But cross-referenced with hospital intake records, they found a woman admitted that same night, Claire Jordan, suffering from second-degree burns to her hands and forearms. She had claimed she was simply walking by when the fire broke out. That she had tried to help. But the hospital file noted something else, almost overlooked. Patient insisted she recognized a child being carried away but was denied access by staff citing procedural limits. Jake's name, at that time, wasn't Jake. He had been processed under a temporary placeholder, John Doe No. 4, then reassigned as Benjamin Harper by his first foster placement. When that arrangement failed, the name changed again, each file breaking continuity. By the time he was finally adopted at 5 years old, he had become Jake Reeves, his 4th name in as many years. The system had buried his history beneath misfiled folders and clerical shortcuts. Claire had kept searching. They found a stack of letters she had sent to the state's Department of Child Services, requesting updates, asking for clarification, pleading to be allowed contact with the boy she claimed she had rescued. Each letter was stamped received and marked with a reference number, but none had been answered. In one, she wrote, he had a scar on his wrist, shaped like a half-moon. He wore a blue shirt with a missing button. He cried, but he didn't scream. Please, I know it was him. Jake looked down at his wrist, where the crescent-shaped scar still remained, proof of a night he couldn't remember but would carry forever. It wasn't just about confirming a relationship now. It was about restoring what had been erased. With the help of a nonprofit that specialized in reunification cases, Lacey filed for a formal record correction. It wouldn't change the past, but it would acknowledge it. It would let the truth live in ink instead of only in memory. And then there was the letter. The one addressed to my children. They had waited to open it. Together, one quiet morning, the sky outside the window a soft gray and the world hushed, they sat side by side on Lacey's couch. The envelope opened with a reluctant tear. The paper inside was worn but carefully folded. If you are reading this, then somehow, the story has found its way home. I don't know how much you know. Maybe you know everything. Maybe nothing. But I want you to understand this. You were both loved. From the moment I saw your faces, you were mine. Even if the world said otherwise. Even if the rules told me I couldn't hold you both. To my son, I never stopped looking. I never stopped believing. When I pulled you from that building, I thought I had time. But time wasn't kind. I tried. I asked. I begged. The system said I didn't belong to you. But you belonged to me. To my daughter, you were my healing. You never had to fix anything. Your smile did that on its own. I may have found you later, but you were always meant to be mine. If you have each other now, then somehow, my heart has mended. Tell the truth. Live with grace. And know that love can wait longer than anyone imagines. Jake's hand shook. Lacey closed her eyes, as if the words had wrapped themselves around her chest and refused to let go. The silence between them was no longer empty, it was filled with something sacred. They weren't just people who had crossed paths because of an app. They were a story interrupted, then resumed. In the weeks that followed, Jake met with the adoptive parents who had raised him, two kind, aging teachers who had given him a stable life, even as he questioned his place in the world. He brought Lacey with him. Introduced her as his sister. They cried quietly in the living room as his mother clutched both their hands, whispering that she had always known there was someone missing. Lacey, in turn, showed Jake the quiet corners of their mother's life. The recipes written in marginless notebooks. The garden she had tended with devotion. The dusty albums with gaps, now filled with context. They lit a candle by Claire's photograph and placed the two rings side by side for a moment on the mantel. Symbols, finally whole. What they found wasn't neat. It didn't come with tidy endings. But it came with peace. It came with restoration. It came with truth. There was no ceremony. No parade. No headline in a local paper. But something in the air had changed. In the small ways that matter most, life shifted. The cafe where Lacey and Jake had first met became a kind of landmark, not for what it looked like, but for what it held. Once just a neutral meeting place, now it became the point where something long broken began to mend. They met there often now, not out of habit, but out of reverence. Sometimes they sat in the same corner booth with quiet coffees and open journals, sometimes with photo albums and new fragments of the past discovered in unlikely places. The rings, once worn as solitary reminders, were now joined in a small wooden box on Lacey's bookshelf. Together, finally. Lacey no longer felt untethered. The ring had always whispered, "You're not alone." Now, it was no longer a promise. It was a truth. Jake, too, had found steadiness. The anger that had once simmered in him, toward a system that failed, toward memories that never settled, began to fade into something more like acceptance. He still carried the weight of those early years, but it no longer pressed so hard against his chest. Instead, he focused on rebuilding. He reconnected with his adoptive parents more deeply, no longer feeling like a visitor in their home. And with Lacey, he found the part of himself he didn't know had been missing, a sibling, a witness, a shared history written in silence and fire. Their relationship, formed from the ashes of loss and built on the fragile bricks of truth, grew stronger by the week. They didn't call it fate. That word felt too theatrical, too distant. What they had was not fate, it was survival stitched into family. It was kindness passed down through burned skin and hidden letters. On the first anniversary of Claire's death, they held a quiet memorial. It wasn't large. Just a table in Lacey's garden, with 2 chairs, a candle, and a framed photo of Claire in the center. They read aloud from her letter. Planted a small tree. Jake brought soil from his childhood home, and Lacey laid a piece of their mother's favorite fabric beneath the roots. The tree stood crooked at first, leaning slightly toward the wind. But they both agreed it would grow stronger in time. Around them, life moved forward. Lacey started volunteering at a nearby children's advocacy center. Not for recognition. Not even because of what happened. But because she now understood how many stories go untold, how many threads are cut short. She helped file records, digitize old paperwork, sit with nervous foster children during transitions. She didn't explain why. She just did the work. Quietly. Thoroughly. Jake applied to be a mentor for at-risk teens. Once a week, he met with a 15-year-old boy who had been through 3 homes in 2 years. He didn't try to fix him. Just listened. Brought him coffee. Sat with him in silence when the boy couldn't find the words. It was enough. They had found not just family, but purpose. And one afternoon, as they walked together through a city park, they were stopped by a stranger. She was older, with silver hair and hands that trembled slightly. She had noticed the rings. She said she had seen something similar once, long ago. She asked about them. Jake and Lacey shared a few pieces of the story. The woman pressed a hand to her heart and nodded. My son died in a shelter fire. In '92, she said, voice catching. I always wondered if anyone had made it out. Jake didn't speak right away. But then, gently, he took the woman's hand and said, someone did. She wept quietly. Not for herself, perhaps, but for something that had finally found ground to land on. That's how it spread. Not through viral posts or sweeping speeches, but through moments like that, quiet recognitions, truths passed between hands, stories completing themselves one listener at a time. A local community center asked if Lacey and Jake would be willing to speak to a group of young adults aging out of the foster system. At first, they declined. Too personal. Too raw. But eventually, they said yes. They stood side by side in a modest room with flickering lights and mismatched chairs, and they told their story, not polished, not perfected, but whole. They brought the rings, the letter, the photograph. They explained how loss doesn't always end in emptiness. How sometimes, the most important connections are the ones waiting in silence for the right moment to be seen. Afterward, a teenage girl approached and said, I thought I was the only one who didn't know where I came from. Lacey looked at her, then at Jake. You're not alone, she said. Jake nodded beside her. I am here. And the girl smiled for the first time that day. The message in the rings had traveled from a fire in Wisconsin, across years of silence, through systems designed to forget. It had reached them in a coffee shop, unfolded through old letters, and had now passed to someone new. Their mother had been right. Love could wait. And when it arrived, it asked for nothing but to be believed. Not everyone would understand. Not everyone needed to. But for those who had been lost, for those searching, for those wondering if the world had room for their story, the answer was simple. Kindness without question is enough.